Hi. We have, 14 special guests tonight, the prospective graduate students of next year's first year class. So welcome to you all. You'll see what we spend our Tuesday nights doing, or every other Tuesday night. You get some reprieve once in a while. Anyway, I'm here to introduce Molly Warnock, but first I want to just remind you, although it seems to be a long way away after your 2-week holiday coming up, but on April 5th we have Julie Alt lecturing. Where are you, Julie? Wave your hand. Yes, in a title, under a title saying "Undoing the Past: Recuperated Document and Uncertain History." And we hope to see, except for the 14 of you who'll be back doing whatever you're doing, making decisions. You can still come. But we hope you'll all be here for that. But I'm very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Molly Warnock. She completed her doctorate at Johns Hopkins, writing her dissertation on the paintings of Hantai. Simon Hantai. I never know if you can do a Hungarian or a Parisian. I'll try to pronounce it correctly, but they'll wait and hear you say it properly. So what does it matter how I pronounce it? But after teaching briefly at the University of Chicago and Emory, Molly returned to Johns Hopkins in 2013 with a joint appointment in both the Department of the History of Art and the Humanities Center. And in general, her work focuses on the history of modernist painting in post-war France, particularly on the work of Hantai, about whom she'll be speaking tonight. In 2012, she published a volume in France on Hantai and subsequently published several journal articles based on and expanding that particular research. But she's also written several essays on contemporary painters, including James Bishop, Alan Uglow, and Julia Fish. Her project, though, here at the Clark, is devoted to her upcoming book, Simone Hantai and the Remains of Painting. He's best known for his abstract paintings that many consider to be the European response to Jackson Pollock. Hantai developed new methods of applying paint, sometimes painting on unstretched, crumpled, or even knotted canvases. Although shown internationally, Hantai's work is best known in France, where his work influenced the next generation of artists during the 1960s and 1970s. And during his lifetime, he died just a couple of years? 2008. Hantai was very productive, working for nearly 50 years, and Molly's book will be one of the first comprehensive accounts of his artistic career and evolution. Not only was he an important painter, what was particularly interesting, I think, about him, he was deeply engaged with contemporary philosophy and critical theory. And Molly's book will also look into the relationship between Hantai's later works from 1960 until his death, and how the challenges and developments the artist made within a medium relate to his interest in philosophy. I hope we hear more about that. Overall, through a broad investigation into several of Hantai's evolving and expanding artistic practices, Molly's work furthers our understanding of medium as such, and how a medium itself can relate to society in a variety of unexpected ways. So, please join me in welcoming Molly Warnock.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for that very generous introduction. I'd also like to thank all of you in attendance And of course, to express my gratitude to the many people whose generosity and resourcefulness have made this such a fantastic place to think and work. And so even if their praises have been sung in this room many times already, I'd be remiss not to single out in particular, in addition to Michael and Keith Moxie, Deborah Fair, Chris Hoyer, Ashton Fancy, Lauren Canaday, Elliot Krasnopoulos, Tucker Blair, John Kimbriel, the faculty and students of Williams Art History, and my fellow fellows. Thank you for the conversations, the moral and technical support, the image scanning, the weekly trips to the grocery store, the piano playing, and plenty of good food and wine, among many other things. Hantai Steps Out proclaims a headline in the March 12, 1998 edition of the Parisian daily Libération. The ensuing double-page feature details the curious case of the Hungarian-born French painter Simon Hantai, a figure then in his 76th year. Presented as one of the most admired artists of his generation, Hantai would have been known to readers primarily for the expansive body of abstract, often very large paintings he had produced between the years 1960 and 1982 in the medium he called pliage, or folding. Essentially the painting of a crumpled, gathered, or systematically pleated canvas that was then unfolded and stretched for exhibition. Widely exhibited from the later 60s within his adopted country and beyond, Hantai's pliage paintings had gained him a reputation both as one of the earliest and most important artists in France to have noticed and taken seriously the work of Jackson Pollock, and as a key predecessor figure for a host of younger producers, including Daniel Buren and the painters of Support Surface. But by 1998, Hantai had for 15 years refused to show his work, withdrawing instead into the privacy of his studio residence in Paris or in Main, a hamlet near the Forêt de Fontainebleau. The Libération article announces the end of that self-imposed exile, as signaled by the painter's then current exhibition at Rennes Espace, a non-commercial site in the capital owned by filmmaker Claude Berry. The show itself contained additional surprises. Among the 22 paintings on view, 11 provided a representative sampling of Hantai's classic pliage work. The remaining half, however, had been completed in the roughly 9 years leading up to the exhibition, which is to say, entirely within the span of the artist's hiatus from public life. Entitled L'Essai, these paintings resulted not from a further modification of Hantai's folding method, but rather from the selective reworking of fragments cut from earlier canvases. In particular, the very large format tabulas the painter had completed in 1981 and included that same year in the last museum survey to which he had contributed actively at the CAPC Anthropolène in Bordeaux. Libération has favorable things to say about the L'Essai, whose overall effect a second headline deems resolutely contemporary. Yet the feature remains silent on the larger question of why the artist should have returned to exhibition with just these works. In this, it sets a precedent for subsequent writing about Hantai's later period, in which the painter's final group of new canvases appears largely eclipsed by the long silence preceding its public debut. By and large, the paintings have been reduced to mere bookends, remarkable less for what they give to be seen than for the sustained withdrawal they render salient, and whose motivations are broadly understood to lie outside his art. To be sure, Hantai himself encouraged a now widespread understanding of his retreat as motivated by external factors. In his reported remarks to Libération, for example, the painter decries what he sees as the affirmative mutual embrace of national museums and supposedly advanced artists. If the state and the avant-garde are linked, he remarks dryly, there is something wrong. One reason for his egress, one is left to presume, is that he had come to fear absorption into this very system. Famously loath to exhibit from an early moment in his career, as Surrealist leader André Breton had noted already in 1953, Hantai now professes his desire to remain marginal, something like a gutter rat. This is his phrase. Elsewhere in the same feature, however, the painter's remarks open onto rather different territory. The French state's official stance toward those it has itself deemed marginal. In a seeming departure, Hantai refers explicitly to recent legislation severely restricting immigration to France, the so-called Pasca laws passed in 1993 and reformed as recently as the previous year, 1997. I am a foreigner, the artist remarks, adding, when they were passed, I believed the Pasca laws were directed specifically at me. He continues, but we haven't the words to express it. We don't know how to talk about those things. We never quite get to the politics of with. For the first time, I heard the word clandestine used as an insult, whereas it was a very beautiful word during the war. Hantai's comments implicitly reframe his own return to visibility, tying it to larger questions of community. He casts the French state as becoming ever more closed, or at any rate aspiring to a certain closure. Its dread of the clandestine translates a larger refusal of the other as outsider. By contrast, I will want eventually to suggest that Hantai's l'essai attempt to pose the very question he believed was being repressed, that of how to acknowledge others, to acknowledge their claims upon oneself. Otherwise put, what he felt politics had failed to think through meaningfully, the logic of with, Hantai appropriated as a problem for painting. This turns out to entail something very different than simply becoming or staying clandestine, that is, withholding or reserving himself indefinitely from public life. A deep and abiding question about the possibilities and impossibilities of community accompanies Hantai's painting from the first. His last major painting, before his move to pliage methods, the monumental canvas Peinture Écriture Rose, we might translate this as the rose-colored writing work, emerges from a set of damning diagnoses about secular modernity. These take shape in a succession of manifesto-like texts of a sort Hantai would never again produce after his shift to folding. The last of those polemics, the deliberately confounding, accelerating, and other notes for a reactionary, non-reducible avant-garde of March 1958, cast the painter's present as at once mired in materialism and increasingly under the sway of various, notionally progressive, yet ultimately stultifying regimes of rationalization, a somber order of technical efficiency, inhospitable to any authentic sense of sacrifice, and therefore, the artist suggests, any genuine communion. Of particular concern to Hantai was the place, or rather non-place, left to art, painting in particular. Paintings, the 1958 text tells us, might continue to appear, but the vast majority would not matter. Having lost their traditional connection to the sacred, they had descended to the level of psychological enchantment, literary dabbling, entertainment, distraction. Hantai's response since the early 1950s had been to appeal ever more stridently to presumed ahistorical forces conceived as capable of leveraging society from the outside. In his first years in Paris, spent in the surrealist circle of André Breton, the key notion was automatism. The painter's first text, the 1955 Plantaneous Demolition, presents automatism as an instrument for stripping language of its externality, ultimately revealing the logical structure and sacred essence of the mental, its univocal hieroglyph. Surrealist poetry, thus construed, counts not as an end in itself, but only as a conduit to that electrifying source. Subsequently, in the wake of his rupture with Breton, and partly under the impress of his first encounters with the work of Jackson Pollock, Hantai tips first toward the sacred eroticism of Georges Bataille, as manifest in his newly frenzied, as it were, orgiastic marking, and then, by 1957, toward varieties of Christian mysticism. As different as these moments appear initially, they nonetheless turn upon structurally analogous appeals to what the 1958 notes call a supra-individual state, something alternately lower or higher, than the finite self and its psychology. Two further closely related aspects of Hantai's work in this period merit attention. The first is its markedly gestural and quasi-graphic impetus, a feature indicative of the formative role of surrealist practices of automatic writing in particular. The painter seems not to have understood his gestural inscriptions, even at their most handwriting-like, as personal in any meaningful sense. Rather, they were for him the traces of something more like dictation, produced in a state of dissociation and transcribed from a luminous parasite. This is another early figure from his first text on automatism. By the same token, the gestures mattered not in and of themselves, but only as traces of that supposedly undivided moment of pure transmission, an instant imagined as if outside of time, on the other side of history's mirror. The second aspect brings us back to the notion of the clandestine, a word the later Hantai of the Libération interview recalls having been beautiful during the war. Throughout his first decade in France, the painter seems to have conceived community as necessarily withdrawn from society at large. Demolition reaffirms Breton's earlier call for the deep occultation of surrealism, while the later notes announce themselves as a manner of introduction to a climate preparatory to the work, that is, as something like an initiation for those few readers willing to endure the obscure night of the soul, to which Hantai presents his practice as addressed. The literal illegibility of his writing-like gestures appears keyed at least equally to this, as do the extraordinary density and elliptical, at times vertiginous syntax of the manifestos themselves. Écriture rose takes over and transforms all of this. Produced in profound isolation over the course of roughly 1 year, from late 1958 to the end of 1959, the painting was Hantai's largest to date. So you see Hantai standing next to the work there. The painting is about a little bit over 10 feet by 13 feet, so it's almost exactly twice as tall as Hantai himself. It also was the first to include real writing, as opposed to broadly writerly gestures, its vast surface having been covered entirely with meticulously hand-copied text from a vast range of biblical, liturgical, philosophical, and poetic sources. The move to copying was meant in part to check what Hantai saw increasingly as the manual facility, or one might say technical efficiency, of gestural abstraction generally, but it had an unexpected effect. In particular, and precisely as he aimed to immerse himself more fully in religious tradition, Hantai, in the course of making Écriture rose, appears to have found himself forced, as he had not been forced previously, to confront Western thinking about the sacred as precisely a body of texts, bound to history and exposed to reading. Likewise, Hantai at the end of this year found himself faced not with a univocal hieroglyph, the old dream of demolition, but, far from it, a veritable palimpsest. Pliage begins here, and it does so by converting what had been a fantasy of frictionless transmission into a more difficult thought of painting as a medium traversed by excess and reserve, always doing more and otherwise than Hantai could be said, strictly speaking, to have intended. Hantai's work for Bordeaux brings us to another moment of crisis. Already at the end of the 1970s, from the time of his 1976 retrospective at the Musée National d'Art Moderne until 1979, Hantai had ceased to paint for some 3 years. Partly for that reason, his show at the CAPC was conceived primarily as a retrospective of his pliage work up to 1976, so thus the title that you see there. The artist nonetheless decided to make a suite of new paintings specifically for the site's large open nave. The French automaker Renault, at that time state-owned and a major sponsor of contemporary art, provided financial support and working space at one of its garages in the commune of Maison-Alfort, outside Paris, thus allowing Hantai to work at significantly larger dimensions than had been possible thus far. Work on the new paintings began in 1980 and continued into 1981. The Séat-Baissé canvases constitute a distinct group within the tabulas, Hantai's longest-running pliage suite. Earlier works in the group, such as a large format tabula of 1976, effectively remake écriture rose within the terms of pliage. As the title suggests, these two are writing tables of a sort, an association further reinforced around the time of the Séat-Baissé show by a typically brilliant invitation card by the painter and his dealer for an exhibition of tabula at the latter's Galerie Jean Fournier. But they also differ from that pivotal earlier work in ways that go to the heart of deeper, paradigmatic shifts in Hantai's pliage practice. Like écriture rose, the tabulas as a group bear witness to a concerted slowing down of gesture. Prior to painting, Hantai measured, marked, and folded the entirety of the canvas into a regular grid formation, securing the intersections of the horizontal and vertical pleats with knots. The process could take months. In its methodical, repetitive nature, as in its non-compositional impetus and temporal protraction, the folding of a tabula appears a new avatar of the no less routine acts of daily copying upon the 1958-59 palimpsest. But where in écriture rose, Hantai wrote on the support, in the tabulas he writes with the support, implicating it crucially in what might now be called a play of spacing. Indeed, the painter's own remarks suggest a willful ceding of agency to the canvas, where the act of folding allows Hantai to lose himself. That immersive and notionally blind process is imagined as taking over and transforming the very notion of the graphic, producing, as if of its own accord, line and color in one. Crucially, the final sharing of painted and non-painted zones would always be, to some extent, a surprise to him, conditioned by material factors beyond his control and importantly recalcitrant to individual psychology. Increasingly, as the series developed, Hantai focused on the problem of the work's dimensions, the only real question, as he later claimed. The overall trajectory of the tabulas is toward ever larger and frequently environmental formats, and by expanding his dimensions, the painter took himself to be following Henri Matisse's famous dictum, according to which 1 square centimeter of blue is less blue than 1 square meter of the same blue. In experimenting both with the total size of the canvas as with the internal dimensions of the painted squares, Hantai was fascinated above all with the ways in which variations in just these two parameters could radically transform the dynamism and intensity of chromatic effect. The Séat-Baissé canvases pushed this exploration to extremes, unprecedented within Hantai's work, canvases measuring up to 9 meters high by 15 meters long. Lacking the means to stretch them, a final step on which he typically insisted, the artist had no choice but to show them without supporting chassis. The results were not, in his view, successful. In a 1995 article in the review Our Press, critic Catherine Millet offers a succinct summary of the painter's dissatisfaction. Looking at photographs of the exhibition, Hantai expresses two criticisms. The whites, due to the very large knots necessitated by the dimensions of the canvases, are too large. They are practically legible forms. Some resemble columns, comparable to those in the actual space. As a consequence, they separate the squares in such a manner that the latter arrange themselves in a series. Millet, following Hantai, cast the overall effect in terms of a collapse into the decorative, a fate she understands as one of the greatest dangers facing post-Matissian painting generally. Among other examples, Millet points to then recent work by Hantai's one-time friend and professed admirer, Daniel Buren, a corpus that included another outsized installation in exactly the same space. What I want to insist on more particularly is another closely related collapse, that of any meaningful notion of reserve. In reading as figurative, or at least implicitly figure-like, these overlarge and finally inert whites cease to register as interrupting or exceeding the artist's control. And that, in turn, spelled the breakdown of the dialectic at the heart of Hantai's mature pliage work, its ability to figure meaningful resistance to the stultifying subjectivism and psychologism of contemporary society. It is this failure, I submit, that prompts Hantai's withdrawal. This is not to deny that institutional factors in the art market play their role, as the painter and various commentators have insisted. It is to set that role in perspective. Hantai's intense pessimism about the art market was nothing new, nor was his reluctance to exhibit. And what the artist saw as the closure of the French cultural apparatus in 1982 was less a virgin phenomenon than an updated version of the situation of static exhaustion he had bemoaned already in 1958. What was new, or at any rate struck Hantai as new, was the seeming incapacity of his painting to resist that closure and thereby point toward other vistas. Without such a prospect, the painter could have seen no clear way of moving forward, and in 1982, as in 1958, Hantai's answer was retreat. Something of the suffocating atmosphere of the artist's early withdrawal is palpable in his first attempt to resume painting. Beginning in 1984, Hantai produced a body of never exhibited works founded on a new method whose initial operations derive from earlier series. A primed but unstretched canvas was crumpled from edge to edge, painted a multiplicity of colors, and then unfolded. Where the process differed was in what happened next. Confronted with the results, Hantai then cut the initial canvas into 2 or more new canvases and subjected each of those sections to a repetition of the entire procedure, and so on, ad infinitum. The resulting works he called brouillage, a typically polyvalent title that carries connotations of perturbation, confusion, and signal jamming. And indeed, the paintings tend toward fogginess or befuddlement. Brouillage in their early stages, so for example, this is an earlier state, as is this over here. Brouillage in their early stages reveal a striking interplay of painted areas and non-painted reserves, characteristic of Hantai's classic pliage production. However, subsequent acts of refolding and repainting tended to reduce those initial contrasts, as if slowing down or silting up vision itself. Hantai stopped work on the brouillage in 1986, after which appears to have followed another caesura, or sustained regrouping. The reasons for that halt in production are unclear. Had the painter become dissatisfied with the entropic drift of the suite as a whole, with the droning sameness of its results? What is apparent is that when he did begin work on his next and last body of paintings, those he would eventually call l'essai, his process at once borrowed and yet differed meaningfully from that deployed throughout the brouillage, as if an implicit correction of his earlier course. A handful of l'essai bear 1989 as their end date, but most were completed in the mid to late 1990s, and a significant number are the fruits of one afternoon in August 1995, a session amply documented, upon Hantai's request, by his longtime friend, painter Antonio Semeraro. Photographs by the latter offer visual evidence of a working procedure that was by that point paradigmatic of the l'essai generally, and that the artist clearly wanted to make known. In particular, they show Hantai turning his cutter directly upon a c'est-à-passer painting. As with the brouillage, one canvas becomes many, yet in a consequential departure from that earlier suite, Hantai dispenses with refolding and repainting. Some of the freshly copped fragments are deposited directly in a corner of the garden for composting, while others are brought back to the studio and subsequently stacked on the floor or tacked on the walls for further consideration. After a time, select remnants are restretched as new paintings, a process that may or may not involve attaching the leftover sections to fresh canvas. The results are very different from the brouillage, both formally and philosophically, and those differences turn, it seems to me, on a deep shift in Hantai's conception of his work at the time. Where the earlier paintings reveal the relentless grinding up of an initially contrastive structure, the visibly divided and displaced laissez suggest a more nuanced understanding of what Hantai soon would call the politics of width. In thinking through those differences, I want now to introduce an additional context, one I believed helped Hantai to consider anew some of his longest-standing preoccupations, and indeed, to work through the impasses in his recent painting. In 1986, just as Hantai was abandoning work on the Pliage, the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy published La Communauté des Oeuvres, a book translated into English as The Inoperative Community. Based on an earlier essay in the journal Alea, where it appeared in 1983, and written in continuous reference to the work of Martin Heidegger, and especially Georges Bataille, the text is keyed in its entirety to what Nancy in its opening lines calls the gravest and most painful testimony of the modern world, that of the dissolution, the dislocation, or the conflagration of community. Nancy's own reckoning with these issues is deeply indebted to Derridian deconstruction and shows him extending the implications of that writing for a new conception of the relations between individual and collective. Hantai's interest in deconstruction predates his withdrawal. The painter had read Derrida from an early moment and was further aware throughout the 70s of a loosely deconstructionist discourse around painting in the context of the Paris-based journal Peinture, Cahiers Théoriques, and the group Support Surface, whose painters claimed him as a key predecessor. His first personal contacts with Derrida came in the mid-1980s, when there was briefly discussion of a projected book on Écriture Rose, following Hantai's 1984 donation of that canvas to the Musée National d'Art Moderne. That volume, which was to include an essay by the philosopher alongside texts by other authors, never came to fruition. But the end of the 90s and the first years of the new century did bring collaborations, of which the most important involved Hantai's illustrations for Derrida's 2000 book, Le Toucher, Jean-Luc Nancy, a request that passed by way of Nancy himself, as well as an eventual volume of correspondence among the three men. The laissez were completed prior to these collaborations, but for precisely that reason, they indicate the extent to which the latter projects, when they do come, reflect a genuine meeting of minds. Indeed, Hantai is perhaps best imagined as finding in Nancy new, unintentional glosses on problems he had himself been grappling with from the 1950s forward. The key concept, for our purposes, is what Nancy calls immanentism. The idea that community consists of beings who produce and are held together by their production of their common essence in and as work. Although the idea conjures certain types of societies or regimes, in particular, those we have called totalitarian, Nancy refuses the notion that immanentism is confined to those instances. It constitutes, rather, the general horizon of our time, encompassing both democracies and their fragile judicial parapets. It appears, in short, a new word for the state of closure, or aspiration toward closure, that Hantai has been trying since the 1950s to resist, and invokes anew in his remarks to Libération on the contemporary dread of the clandestine. Against this vision of individuals making themselves without remainder, the philosopher suggests that beings are always and at the same time unmade by their rapport with others in a larger play of sharing and displacement. The articulation of a community so understood thus turns upon a simultaneous movement of disarticulation or unworking, a kind of constitutive reserve. Hantai's laissez, I want to suggest, figure an analogous understanding, even as they posit painting as uniquely capable of figuring that interplay. Here as elsewhere, Hantai's title scatters highly suggestive indices. The substantive opens simultaneously toward notions of the remainder, leftover, or indeed excremental leaving. So for example, Le Petit Larousse offers fiente des sangliers, or wild boar droppings, as a possible meaning of laissez, and toward the rejected outsider or refused delivery, un laissez pour compte. Various accepted usages of the infinitive, laissez, draw it towards death, exile, separation, forgetting, and in a somewhat different register, leaving be, freeing, not consuming, permitting. And their very failure to fold seamlessly one into another as in the more specific associations of each variant, these diverse connotations frame painting as a practice integrally involved not just with empirical remainders, so in this instance, the literal leftovers of the CAPC works, but with something more like the fact of the remainder, with the inevitability of excess. What follows are 4 more specific points about just how this vision emerges in practice. I commence with a deceptively obvious fact. Hantai's work on the laissez effectively begins from that moment that, in his pliage practice, had signaled his detachment from the work, the unfolding of the painted canvas, and the revelation of the results of a heretofore immersive and notionally blind process. Here I want to suggest that Nancy helps Hantai to let go definitively of a certain fantasy of community as communion, and therefore as lost. Nancy writes from within the perception that communication has become problematic, and partly by way of correcting that perception. For the philosopher, this understanding, which we have called modern, rests on an assumption that things were not always so, that there was once an age, now lost, in which community was woven of tight, harmonious, and infrangible bonds. The figures for such a lost or broken community are many. Nancy's partial list includes the natural family, the Athenian city, the Roman Republic, the first Christian community, corporations, communes, or brotherhoods. It is, Nancy thinks, a myth, but it is a myth deeply embedded in the Western world and whose true consciousness is Christian. The community desired or pined for by Rousseau, Schlegel, Hegel, then Bakunin, Marx, Wagner, or Mallarmé is understood as communion. And communion takes place in its principle as in its ends at the heart of the mystical body of Christ. At the same time as it is the most ancient myth of the Western world, community might well be the altogether modern thought of humanity's partaking of divine life, the thought of a human being penetrating into pure immanence. Thus, the thought of community or the desire for it might well be nothing other than a belated invention that tried to respond to the harsh reality of modern experience, namely, that divinity was withdrawing infinitely from immanence, and that the divine essence of community, or community as the existence of a divine essence, was the impossible itself. And we might think back in reading these lines to Hantai's sacred essence of the mental. Moving beyond that invention thereby involves a double recognition. First, that there can be no return to an intimacy that has never taken place. And second, that communication is constituted precisely by such facts of separation and exteriority as have foreclosed that supposedly seamless immanence from the first. In their broad outlines, Nancy's maneuvers amount to a reassertion of the claims of finitude, and of community as the place where finitude appears in all its irredeemable excess. The cuts that make l'essai of Hantai's canvases for the CAPC inherit from previous désœuvrement effects in his work to date, both the self-interrupting skeins of writing in écriture rose and, even more to the point, the unruly eruption of the whites in pliage. Indeed, Hantai's commentators typically have framed Hantai's turn to real cutting as a way of radicalizing the figurative cuts introduced by the non-painted canvas and the painted areas. What one wants to stress more particularly is the extent to which that technical shift nonetheless shows Hantai taking back at least some of the agency, one might even say the responsibility, previously given over to the pliage process. That is, where previously the canvas cut in itself, Hantai now accepts to cut in the canvas. Although responsive to the figurative cuts of the non-painted reserves, Hantai's lacerations are not confined to those areas, nor do they follow their contours. Rather, those incisions effectively inscribe the painter's intentionality, hearkening back to the movements of wrist, arm, and shoulder. This amounts to a new willingness to draw, and as such, it implies a concerted liquidation of the earlier aspiration to lose himself in the folding process. Through the making of a laissez, the canvas is exposed to Hantai, and he to it. But what Nancy calls clear consciousness of separation cannot and does not translate into new techniques of mastery. The cutter is a deliberately crude instrument on a par with Pollock's paint stick or Matisse's scissors. In another nod to Pollock, and as in Pliage generally, Hantai retains a commitment to working horizontally, putting himself inside the canvas as opposed to comfortably in front of it. In fact, insofar as the cutter necessitates contact, it requires that Hantai get even closer than Pollock to the cloth support. Indeed, that he stoop more or less continuously as he moves through the work, usually backwards. And where that already painted surface is literally exposed to his gaze, Semereo's photographs suggest another kind of blinding, one associated less with the opacity of material folds than with the too bright illumination of the sun, as reflected off the large non-painted zones in particular. All of these obstacles appear pitted against the facility of the hand, a point underscored by the inevitable roughness of the resulting cuts. And letting those uneven and frequently fraying edges stand, Hantai assumes both the finitude and the contingency of decisions previously left to a supposedly objective process. Second point turns upon the notion of singularity. Throughout his writings on community, Nancy is at pains to distinguish a notion of singular being from what he sees as a misguided emphasis on the individual, construed as something like an indivisible unit. Where the individual is imagined as prior to relationality, the singular being, as Nancy intends the term, would be constituted from the first by its belonging to community. His neologism for the specific phenomenality of this being is comperence, a literal translation of Heidegger's Mitsein, or being with, indicating that, to quote Nancy, finite being always presents itself together, hence severally, for finitude always presents itself in being in common and as this being itself. Bound up with others, this being nonetheless is endlessly particular, at once the excess and the remainder of that primordial sharing. It is that condition the philosopher believes remains to be thought. What, he asks, is a body, a face, a death, a writing, not indivisible, but singular? These meditations illuminate Hantai's earlier worry about the squares of the tabulas at the Seapese falling apart into series, in the sense of a sheer enchainment of seemingly disconnected units. Earlier tabulas turn entirely upon the lateral interplay among the seemingly repeated, but in fact always different areas of painted color. And insofar as those forms appear literally all at once upon Hantai's unfolding of the completed canvas, these paintings, more than any other in his corpus, offer a native model of Nancy's dynamics of comperence. But it was precisely this sense of mutual interplay that appeared to him lost among the columnar whites of the Bordeaux work, blanks that, as he would later see them, simply divided without also linking the forms to either side. Against that collapse into mere seriality, the laissez-appear Hantai's attempt to expose both the absolute particularity of each painted form and its primordial entanglement with the others. As in Nancy, this turns out to involve something very different from simply reducing the work to indivisible units. Among the earliest laissez, one finds a handful of paintings featuring single squares, works made by restretching just one, more or less integral form, with whatever suturing to fresh canvas that required. Take, for example, two laissez, one predominantly violet, one mostly blue, both dated 1981, 1989, and both detached from the same multiform tabula. In both works, Hantai has provided clues, or left clues, really, that the painted form originated in a larger play of repetition and difference. Not only do there remain clearly preserved traces of the folded grid, which you can maybe make out in this slide, just a little bit in this lower corner. It's very evident when you stand in front of them. So you have that. There also appear bits of runoff color from once adjacent areas, the brighter blue limning the upper edge of the violet form, the jet of pinkish runoff to the left of the blue one. Yet as these remarks have begun to suggest, each form nonetheless appears unique, an effect not only of their chromatic differences, but also, and more crucially perhaps, of the way each is articulated by non-painted reserves. Both emerge from a larger play of spacing, but each does so differently, indeed unrepeatably. Against what I have called the droning sameness and entropic drift of the brouillage, These paintings appear keyed to what Nancy calls the excess of finitude, the bottomless singularity of each painted remainder, in its simultaneous proximity to and distinctness from all the others. A third single square laissez postdates these examples and evokes comparance by other means, most notably through the relatively looser articulation of the whole. Each of the four corners bears the traces of a knot far larger than could conceivably have been produced with a canvas of the size to which the fragment now stands affixed. The result, as Catherine Millet has noted, is a powerful disjunction between the internal scale of the non-painted reserves and the literal size of the new whole. This effect, too, acknowledges the form's origination within a larger field. The third point pushes the idea of adjacency, this idea of adjacency, toward Nancy's ruminations on exposure. For Nancy, as for Bataille and Derrida before him, exposure is above all an experience of writing and of being read by others, an experience he presents as one of willed or active passivity. Hantai's laissez, for their part, interpret this notion via a range of effects one might qualify as photographic, suggesting that photography functions not simply as a means of recording process, but as something more like a model for the series as a whole. Consider, to begin with, one of the largest paintings in the group, a violet laissez standing just under 12 feet tall and slightly over 7.5 feet wide. Unlike the single square laissez, it derives from a tabula with just 3 painted areas at comparatively vast dimensions. So you can see we're looking essentially this fragment up here. A vertical strip cropped from the latter appears alongside a fresh margin of non-painted canvas. The effect is photographic, as if a viewfinder has jerked slightly to one side of the painted field to include a fragment of the blank lateral space beyond it. The work appears displaced beyond, or rather beside itself, pointing at once to the larger, non-painted world in which it appears, and to the other, as it were, adjacent paintings in the suite. This canvas stands in light of those others and sheds light on them. Another, closely related work opens toward a range of additional issues. A set of silk screens on canvas, Untitled reproduces photographic views shot in dramatically raking perspective. Taken by Hantai's friend and fellow artist Camille Major at the Maison Alfort during the preparations for the CAPC show, and subsequently cropped anew by the artist, these anamorphic extracts offer something like the painter's own perspective from all fours, yet they also displace that vision from the binocular register of human seeing to the monocular view of the machine. Untitled enacts a further estrangement, rotating the selected elements from the horizontal axis of production to the emphatically upright formats of the finished work. Doubly detached from what we might imagine as a lived situation of extreme intimacy with, or quasi-corporeal immersion in the unfinished canvases, this work refigures Hantai's painting as exposed or abandoned in another way, to the notionally infinite iterations and alterations of mechanical reproduction. 4, this is the final point, perhaps the most consequential effect of the laissez, in the short term at least, is Hantai's actual return to exhibition, exposition in French, as if the work begun in the making of those paintings had necessarily to unfold into their public showing. Nor was the 1998 exhibition at Rennes Espace a solitary event. Important donations by the artist to the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris and the Musée National d'Art Moderne followed quickly, as did a major retrospective of the Pliage work in Münster, Germany, little more than a year later. From the first, however, the laissez have been shadowed by a number of fragments that do not, and presumably never will, show. Those remainders consigned to the compost pile. Hantai had composted work before, including around the time of his withdrawal from painting. Significantly, in the summer of 1997, which is to say, the season immediately preceding his return to exhibition, the painter spent some time digging in his yard. Digging in his yard, temporarily exhuming the decomposing vestiges and photographing his findings before returning them to the earth. As with the making of the laissez, the photographs suggest a larger desire that this process, too, be exposed to others, And indeed, Hantai shared these pictures with various friends and writers about his work, myself included. They constitute part of the extended field of practice from which the laissés emerge. The photographs push what I have been casting implicitly as a phantasmatic association of paintings and persons to a particular conclusion. They show paintings, or rather these paintings, return to the proverbial ashes and dust. Their bodies, like human bodies, are ephemeral, pass away. One anticipates a not so distant future in which even these traces will have been lost. That future also awaits the rejected remainders of 1995. And this awareness, once achieved, folds back upon our experience of the laissés as such. A thought of reserve that marks Pliage from the first has been turned explicitly toward the unworking that awaits each and every one of us, that is always already underway, and that is the actual shape of our community, no less than ourselves. I find I have cast the laissé in the tradition of the vanitas. And here is throughout that tradition the sensuousness of pliage. A certain luxuriating in material particulars plays its role and plays it to the end. But it remains an exuberance haunted by the specter of death. Read against Hantai's trajectory to date, as against his remarks at the moment of reappearance, the laissés seek to acknowledge the finitude, the exposure, and the irreducible contingency that condition every presentation. Call this an attempt to make room for the excluded and the clandestine, but it is also, and just as importantly, a matter of Hantai working through his own earlier tendency toward clandestinity, construed as willful hiddenness, occultation, or withdrawal. It is an attempt to figure being with, otherwise, not simply again, but also anew. Thank you.
Standing at the ready, questions or comments?
Do you have any sense of why he rejects the paths he rejects?
I mean, I think part of it is arbitrary, right? On a certain level, there's an idea that he can't keep all of them. He's going to get rid of some of them. He takes some back to the studio. He continues to sort them out a bit, right? I mean, I think he's just sort of grabbing things that strike him in that moment. He then takes out additional bushels of painting fragments that he decides he doesn't need cluttering up the studio. But I don't think there's a strong judgment principle in the moment of sorting them. I think he just needs to get a certain amount of work out of the way. But then once he takes it back to the studio, it's at the moment of stretching it, putting it next to a canvas, seeing what that looks like, that a real act of judgment happens, right? He decides whether it matters to him or not. And it's actually the fact that there is that moment of judgment, right, at whatever point it intervenes, really matters. Because Hantai, throughout his life, is completely committed to the idea that a painting can fail, sometimes does fail. Now, what that means, will change. But in a sort of general sense, Hantai's way of putting it would be, well, in the work, you have to feel that the non-painted paints as much as the painted, right? It has to be as fully active, engaged, dynamic as what he has himself done, right? So if it just looks inert the way that it could in some of those tabulas from the Seapese show, it's a failed painting, right? The non-painted doesn't paint. With the laissé, I mean, there's a sense that you have the non-painted within the painted area that has to paint, but then you also have to have a sense of something like the further non-painted or non-painting, represented by that unworking. Right? So you have, when you have those strips of fresh canvas, I think that's a really interesting gesture because there's a way in which that, you could put it two ways, right? You could say either that materializes the temporal gap between the 1981 moment and the moment of reworking, or you could say that in some general sense, he's temporalizing the non-painted that's been at the heart of his work from the beginning. So it becomes ever more complex, but it has to register as an active force of dissemination, I guess we would say. Does that answer?
Absolutely. Thank you.
You told me the other day he comes to Paris, I think, in '48.
That's right.
Escaping communism in Hungary. Was he a painter when he came to Paris?
Yes. So, in fact, Hantai gets out right before this Sovietization. Hantai's French critics have made a lot of him sort of running away from socialist realism. That's not exactly how it works. I mean, he let that myth go for a certain amount of time, but in fact, he leaves Budapest with a fellowship. He's attended the Budapest Academy of Fine Arts. He's been a kind of star pupil there. And he's given something by the Ministry of Culture that is awarded to outstanding students so they can go have sort of a finishing period in Paris, right? So he goes to Paris. Initially, the idea is that he'll spend 6 months there. He leaves on one of the last trains that you can get going out of Hungary. This is July, right? So it's right as the Sovietization is completing itself. He and his wife sort of walk through Yugoslavia to Italy. They spend another 6 months there waiting for a transit visa. They then make their way eventually to Paris. And by this point, his fellowship has been canceled. They have no idea what they're going to live on, but they've seen and done nothing, right? So they immediately have this choice between living in Paris in abject poverty, but finding themselves in modern art and going back to Budapest and working under that regime. They chose to stay in Paris. His wife was also.
Okay, that was just a factual thing. The thing that strikes me, I know nothing about the state of the French art world in the 1950s, but the thing that strikes me is what seems to be the belatedness of someone in the 50s being caught up with the idea of automatism, which is an idea from the mid-1920s. And so that's why I was wondering, is this a case of sort of provincialism coming to Paris?
Yeah.
Or Yeah, okay.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, Hantai has an extremely checkered understanding of modern art. Right? So
Okay.
he knows some things that he'd been able to glean from the art press and also from a very important mentor for him in Budapest, who is sort of the French cultural attaché to Budapest. So he has sort of an understanding of modernism as like some Picasso from the 1920s, some Bonnard, some Matisse, right? But he has sort of essentially no understanding of what the interwar avant-gardes have been. And when he arrives in Paris, I think that choice for surrealism is really inflected by a number of different factors. One is a kind of desire for community, that you could go to Breton and be surrounded by artists who are having a kind of intellectual discourse, who had experienced that history firsthand. Hantai is almost immediately disappointed by this dialogue, but I think it is sort of a draw. But then, there's a way in which the idea of automatism really is for him the central crux of surrealism, because it's the concept that he sees as never strictly or even primarily aesthetic. For him, it's a concept that opens immediately onto questions of community. And for him, it really matters that surrealism was a group, right? That it was a group of people trying to do something together. And, in some ways, the great disappointment of Hantai's 1950 is the one that sets him on the trajectory toward Écriture Rose and everything that follows, the sense of, this once promising would-be collective that is now instantiated in these rather tired old men who don't want to hear anything about anything new that's happening, sort of in his experience. Right? So it's surrealism as wanting to be, and in some important sense, failing to be a community that matters.
Okay, the last bit of my question, you said he didn't see, talking about Écriture Rose, that he didn't see it as personal. It wasn't about him, that it was being dictated to. What was doing the dictating?
Well, that's sort of the moment immediately prior to Écriture Rose, right? When we're seeing those, very Georges Mathieu-esque gestural paintings from 57, 58, that's, those are sort of the last gasps of this idea that you can work very quickly and something beyond you seizes control. It's not your brain that moves your hand, but you're in the grips of something, right, which would therefore be more pure and authentic because not sourced in the self for Hantai. Écriture Rose is already in some sense the liquidation of that fantasy, right? I mean, he starts doing this very complicated project, in part because of the sense that his work has hit a total cul-de-sac, right? I mean, you've seen how aesthetic it has gotten at this point, because he's just stripping things away, right? Trying to get down to this dictation. And it turns out you can actually build a viable continuing practice out of that, right? It's not at all clear what you then do to get out of that impasse. So, my sense is that Hantai really turns to copying as doing some of the work that idea of dictation had done before. And of course, you have several questions that immediately follow, like what do you copy? Well, he's going to copy, big frameworks of the Western tradition. So the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, the Catholic liturgy, Freud, Hegel, Kierkegaard, major thinkers. And the idea is that it's still a kind of quieting of the self, right? They're not going to be his words. It's not going to be his voice, right, on the surface of that canvas. And then there's something about that subjection to routine, too, that he's going to get up every day. He's not going to wait for the privileged or exceptional instant of illumination, right? He's just going to get up and he's going to write his painting, He once said, like a baker, right? Like a baker, I got up and I did my work, I wrote my painting. But what happens, a lot of things happen coming out of Écriture Rose, but of course, from the moment that you're copying, well, you're doing that to silence yourself. But it's his handwriting, right? And his handwriting is in some ways inimitable, and it's, keyed to the specific tics of his body, but also to a particular education and socialization he's had, right? So I think what he really comes out of that painting recognizing with a clarity that he's been lacking is that you can't get beyond the personal. You can't get beyond this, right? What you can hope for, perhaps, is a material practice in which you are completely implicated and yet exceed. And that's what he finds. So it is sort of a long, in some ways I think dolorous, but also hopeful putting paid of that idea of dictation and transmission.
I'll wait for the mic just because I've been here long enough. I know I have to. Thank you very much. And actually, I apologize. After your answer, I have to run out. But briefly,
I'll keep it short.
no, keep it long. But so you meant the metaphor of the baker struck me because there was another part of your talk, and this is sort of a more cultural question that where he's not a baker at all. This idea of an artist reaching a kind of impasse inside. In his work or in her work and quitting as a result. Okay, you mentioned he quit for 3 years.
3 years at the end of the 70s,
right.
A long period of time.
So and the idea of quitting, of just stop making work because he's reached a kind of impasse in his mind, no more reserve, whatever and that's not what a baker would do, okay? In an artisanal culture, you just keep on working.
Yeah.
So there's something about this decision that he makes to quit that is so deeply, powerfully modernist. The kind of investment he has that would lead him to the conclusion that because I've reached this impasse, the only solution is sort of not to make any more work. And I just was very struck by that as a kind of modernist gesture, and I wonder if you had any comments on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in some ways it's a kind of necessary posture that comes out of some of his earliest statements in the 1950s. So when in that weird 1958 text that I cite a lot early in the talk, he's saying, well, our modern lives are like completely deadening. We have no true community. There's no real self-sacrifice. The sort of umbrella term for that condition is somber order of technical efficiency, right? And impasses can happen for Hantai in different ways. It can be that he's reached a kind of material limit. The canvases have gotten so big for reasons that are completely germane to the practice, but now, undo that practice in a particular way, so he's hit a material limit. Or it can also just happen because he's gotten too good at a particular set of gestures. He's achieved a kind of technical efficiency. And that can also be a real problem for him, right? If he knows what that painting is going to look like, more or less, before he makes it, if he has a sense of what his gestures are going to produce, if he is, in fact, not going to be exceeded in any meaningful way, then, he might as well just go watch the grass grow, as he'd like to put it.
So can one, that's a historically specific conclusion, the idea that you actually have to stop making a painting because you've come to this realization.
Yeah, that's right.
And that, anyway, are there other artists who, you know, in this moment who are reach the same drastic conclusions, or?
Well, so I mean, one figure who would be close to Hantai's mind and would be, for him, an important example to not exactly emulate would be Duchamp. Because for, of course, a long period of time, the idea is that Duchamp has abandoned painting, right? This turns out not to be true. But there's a way in which, I think when Hantai, you know, in the early 1980s has withdrawn from painting, but it continues messing around in the studio, that's in part a refusal of what he sees as Duchamp's ironic detachment, right? And his particular cerebral quality, whereas Hantai wants to be meaningfully engaged in material practice, right? So I think he feels compelled in part to just get in the studio, do some stuff with paint, try to surprise himself somehow, to not fall into that posture. So that would be one of the sort of great historical examples for him. But then closer to Hantai, you know, for example, a very important younger figure would be Michel Parmentier, who in 1967-68 forms part of the collective BNPT, what we in the US call BNPT, in which Daniel Durand is also involved. And he's in some ways the figure in that group who is closest to Hantai. He takes over, actually, Hantai's pliage practice, but he makes it ever more routinized. So it's just folding horizontal bands, painting them in one color. It's a real rigidification of Hantai's practice. And he does that for 2 years and then says, okay, I'm not going to paint anymore, and he stops for 15 years. And so Hantai has another sort of example, very close to him, you know, personally as well as, say, aesthetically in some larger sense, of withdrawal as a kind of active, an active critical gesture of a certain sort.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. I was really compelled at the end of the talk, your comparison or your bringing in of those photographs, this exhumation of the discarded remnants of the work. And I mean, I felt you getting at this, but was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit more about I mean, you said that those photographs have been shared with some people, but sort of a limited kind of distribution of people working on Hantai's work. And to me, I see a really interesting correlation between the paintings, this work, and that you know, the gaps, this, you know, what has been left out. Here is made visible, is exhibited as part of what is filled in. And to me, the photographs sort of play a corollary role to the work at large, but those sort of have a limited kind of distribution, or and so I was just hoping maybe you could speak a little bit more to that relationship between the works and the body of work and those photographs of the exhumed remnants, and also that sort of idea of the gaps. And
it's a tricky thing what to do with these photographs in a way, right? I mean, I think Hantai doesn't necessarily want that to be a limited distribution. He's giving them to people who are coming to see them, specifically people that he knows are writing about his work. There's clearly a kind of desire for this to constitute part of the field of reception for that work. And, you know, to a certain extent it works, right? I mean, if you read Georges de Huberman's 1998 book on Hantai, he reproduces some of the photographs, he talks about them. You get some of them in the book of correspondence with Jean de Fancy and with Jacques Derrida. You know, Hantai is very intentional in getting these photographs into the hands of people who will publish them. And there's sort of a sense in which, you know, one doesn't know how you could go beyond that, right? I mean, you can't put together a book of them, right? I mean, they have to be this thing that haunts the paintings, right?
Yeah.
And so it has to, in a way, be a kind of limited publicness. And that that haunting would itself be indexed to some larger question of being structurally contingent upon this, you know, a whole array of factors that might not be fully public acknowledged, right? That can take all different kinds of forms, right? So there's a way in which you know, it's not being something he can put fully out there. Is part of the structure of the thing itself.
I mean, thinking about Derrida too, I mean, there's a supplemental quality to all, I mean, to that whole body, which is interesting in just the way that he's working in that vein of scholarship and theory. So.
And I actually think, I mean, you know, just the act of exhumation itself, right? I mean, this is something that he does the year before that first exhibition at Renaissance. There's a way in which I think it confirms his sense that it's time to show. That which is simply buried in the studio will not count. It has to be exhumed in a way. It has to be brought to publicness. It has to be brought into light. But I also think there's another recognition that happens in the course of that exhumation. I was hoping we might talk about this more, and I brought a couple extra photographs. This is the house in Rome. So here's another photograph of those exhumed remains. And I actually think that in looking at these sort of seething heaps of digested, decomposing canvases in the bowels of the earth, I think he's probably struck, as I always am, by a kind of resemblance to his own Pliage, right? And there's a way in which I think this prompts him to understand those Pliages as themselves tending towards a kind of immanentism, right? That they're paintings that tend toward this foggy closure, that are grinding themselves up, that are, as it were, eating themselves from the inside, digesting themselves in the way that this work is being digested. And I think that you know, is a further impetus for him to put out the Lessig, right? That they can have a different kind of life. And it's something like the recognition that no withdrawal counts without that side of publicness, right? The absence or the silence has to find a kind of public inscription.
That's great, thank you.